The man running across the frozen tundra was wearing a t-shirt. That was the first thing Dara Osi noticed when the emergency feed cut into the monitoring station's main screen. Not the frostbite already blackening the man's fingers. Not the way he kept looking over his shoulder at nothing. Not even the orange jumpsuit shredded at the knees. Just the t-shirt. Cotton, short-sleeved. Like a man who'd stepped out of a Caribbean summer directly into the killing cold of an Arctic night. The second thing she noticed was that he was screaming. Security caught him 400 meters from the perimeter. By the time Dara reached the medical bay, he was strapped to a bed, his voice hoarse to nothing, his eyes moving in patterns that made no anatomical sense. Side to side, yes, but also up and rotating, tracking things in the room that the cameras couldn't see. The base physician, a thin-faced man named Korvac, was standing with his arms folded, and the expression of someone who has already decided the answer and doesn't like it. "He's speaking," Korvac said. "He's been speaking since they brought him in. We just can't understand it." "His implant's not translating?" "His implant is translating perfectly. That's the problem." Korvac pulled up the transcript on his pad and handed it to her. Every word is a real word, from 14 different languages, in no discernible order, as if someone reached into the linguistic center of his brain and scrambled it, like a keyboard where all the keys have been moved. Dara looked at the man on the bed. He was trying very hard to tell them something. His hands strained against the restraints, and his eyes, when they stopped their terrible rotation, fixed on her face with an expression of complete, terrified lucidity. He knew exactly what he wanted to say. He simply could not say it in any language she could understand. She had been a xenoarchaeologist for 11 years. She'd catalogued the ruins on Mirath Forv, had spent 8 months in an excavation pit on the dead moon of Cerebus breathing recycled air and eating protein paste, and arguing with her colleagues about whether a particular arrangement of stones represented a granary or a temple. She had walked through the echoing emptiness of a dozen dead civilizations, and had learned to read the shape of intelligent intent in objects that hadn't been touched in 10,000 years. She had never seen anything like what she saw in that man's eyes. She handed the pad back to Korvac. "When do the new workers arrive?" 6 hours. Delay them." Korvac looked at her carefully. "The collective won't allow." "I know what the collective won't allow." She turned back to the man on the bed. He had stopped straining. He was watching her with an expression she recognized only because she'd seen it in photographs. The look of a person who has just been told, in some indirect and plausibly deniable way, that they are going to be abandoned. "Get me the full exposure log for the test zone, every sensor reading for the last 30 days. And find out when he went in and when his mind started going. I want to know the threshold." She walked out without waiting for an answer, and, behind her, she heard the man begin to make sounds again. Low and rhythmic, and almost, if you turned your head a certain way, almost like singing. The workers arrived anyway. 12 of them this time. The collective had doubled the complement, which Dara understood to mean they had decided that 12 data points were more useful than 6, and that whatever had happened to the previous man was, in the calculus of the project, an acceptable outcome. She watched them come off the transport from the upper observation gallery. They were big, most of them, the kind of humans who built things for a living, who carried their competence in their hands and their spines, who could look at a structure and tell you in 30 seconds what was wrong with it and how to fix it. 3 women and 9 men, ages ranging from what looked like 25 to a weathered 50-something who moved like a man who had survived a great many things and expected to survive several more. They were talking to each other already. That was the thing about humans that the collective had never quite understood. They were almost constitutionally incapable of silence in a new place. They narrated, they joked. They laid claim to their environment with language the way some species laid claim with scent. The one she fixed on was a woman near the back of the group. Compact, dark-haired, carrying a worn bag over one shoulder with the proprietary ease of someone who has lived out of it for years. She was listening to the taller man, beside her the 50-something, who was apparently explaining something with great conviction in both hands, but her eyes were moving steadily around the hangar, cataloging exits, assessing, a builder who thought like a survivor, or possibly a survivor who had learned to build things. Her name, Dara learned from the manifest, was Raina Bach, former military corps engineer, 12 years, then private contractor, structures on 4 different worlds. She had a daughter who was 8 years old, according to the family contact sheet, and a small plot of land on Haverith Station that she was apparently saving to build something on. The contract she had signed, One standard year, sealed location, 10 years salary would make that something possible. She had signed without reading the addendum. They all had. The addendum was the part that explained the phenomenon. Dara had written the addendum herself, and she was not proud of how little it said. The test zone was a perfect disk of summer, 600 meters in diameter, sitting in the middle of the Karev wastelands like a coin dropped from orbit. The collective's terraforming array had been running for 3 years. It had worked, technically. The air within the zone was warm and humid and thick with the smell of growing things. The sky above it, accessed through a dome of carefully managed atmospheric gradient, cycled through 20-hour days and 4-hour nights of deep blue dark. And in those nights the stars were so thick and close that a person standing outside their bunk and looking up might for a moment forget entirely where they were. Reyna learned all of this in the first week. She was methodical about it the way she was methodical about everything. She walked the perimeter on her second morning, not in a straight line but in a spiral, stopping every 20 paces to look back the way she'd come. She checked the soil density at 4 points. She found the location of every surveillance camera before lunchtime on the third day. The other workers took to the place faster than she did. Grum, the 50-something, had bought himself a folding chair and a fishing line, and was dangling it into the small artificial stream that cut through the east section, even though there were no fish. The sisters, Maya and Tella, had set up a card game on one of the equipment crates, and were slowly taking money from anyone who sat down. A young man named Pak, who couldn't have been older than 25, had started trying to grow something in one corner of the barracks yard, pressing seeds from his meal rations into the dark earth, with the focused optimism of someone who has decided to care about something. Reyna watched all of this and said little. She built what they told her to build. Sections of a structure that no one would tell her the purpose of, assembled according to diagrams that showed each piece in isolation with no indication of how it connected to the whole. The work was good work, technically demanding and varied, and she found she could do it well and still have enough attention left over to notice things. What she noticed mostly was the edge. The boundary between the test zone and the surrounding wasteland was not simply a temperature gradient. She had expected that. What she had not expected was the quality of the light at the boundary. The way it bent very slightly, at the perimeter's edge, as if the air itself had a different refractive index inside the zone. She had not expected the sounds, not alien sounds, human sounds, her own voice, sometimes, or a voice very like it, speaking just below the threshold of comprehension, coming from the wrong direction. Once at dusk on the 14th day, she heard her daughter's laugh. Her daughter was 42 light-years away. She told no one. She wrote it in the small notebook she kept in her bag, in the compressed shorthand she'd developed for field reports. Not because she expected anyone to read it, but because writing things down made them real in a way that kept them from becoming something else. The briefing they'd received on arrival had described the phenomenon as a localized atmospheric anomaly with minor psychoacoustic effects. Mild, it had said. Temporary. Nothing that would interfere with work performance. Reyna had been a military engineer. She knew what a briefing that said mild and temporary, without defining either word, actually meant. On the 22nd day, Pak's seedlings came up. He had planted 6. All 6 came up overnight, and when he found them in the morning he stood there for a long moment, and then sat down hard on the ground beside them, not saying anything, touching the small green leaves with one finger, with the careful reverence of a person who has been surprised by tenderness. Reyna watched from across the yard. Later she would think about that moment, his face, the particular angle of the early light, the way the green looked almost impossible against the dark soil. And she would understand that it was the last fully good thing that happened before the bad things started. It began with Grum. He had been sleeping badly, he said, and then he said he hadn't been sleeping at all, and then he stopped mentioning it. He began sitting with his back to walls. He flinched at sounds that the others didn't hear. One morning Reyna found him outside the barracks before dawn, standing very still and staring at the perimeter edge with an expression of total attentiveness, as if something there was speaking to him in a language he was almost managing to understand. "What do you hear?" she asked. He looked at her. For a moment his eyes had the unfocused quality of a person looking at something that is not in the room. Then they sharpened. "Nothing," he said. "I hear nothing." He walked back inside and she heard him pick up the bottle from the shelf by his bunk, and she didn't say anything about it. The monitoring station people came twice a week. They always came in pairs. always took the same readings from the same sensors in the same order, always left without eating, or using the facilities, or doing any of the small things that would have made them seem like beings with lives beyond the clipboard. Dara was the one Reyna had begun to think of as the responsible one. The one who carried something in her face that wasn't quite guilt, but wasn't quite its opposite either, would sometimes linger after the others had gone back to the transport. She would stand just inside the zone's boundary and look at the workers, with an expression Reyna had seen once before. Years ago, on the face of a commanding officer, who had sent a unit into a situation he had known, was wrong and had not found a way to stop. On the 31st day, Reyna asked her directly, "What is it doing to us?" They were standing near the stream. Dara had her clipboard held against her chest. She looked at Reyna for a long moment in the way of someone measuring the distance between what is true and what can be said. "The terraforming array," she said at last. "It works. It creates the atmospheric conditions we needed. But there appears to be a secondary effect we did not anticipate." She stopped. "The array is not purely mechanical. There is a component. We understood it poorly when we designed it, and we understand it better now, which is a kind of progress that does not feel like progress, that interfaces with the local quantum substrate in ways that—" "It's reading us," Reyna said. Dara looked at her. "It's reading us," Reyna said again. "And we're reading it. And some of us are." She thought of Grum, of the bottle by his bunk, of the angle of his body in the dark before dawn. "Aren't filtering it correctly anymore." The silence between them lasted several seconds. In it, Reyna could hear the small sounds of the zone, the manufactured breeze, the insect sound, the atmospheric regulators, made at a frequency just below conscious hearing, and under those, dimly, the sound of her daughter laughing. She put that sound in the notebook. She did not let it be anything else. "How much exposure before the damage is permanent?" she asked. Dara said nothing. "You already know," Reyna said. "That's what you've been measuring." "The previous worker," Dara said. "The one before your cohort. He was here for 41 days. And we're on day 31. "Yes." Reyna looked at the perimeter. The light bent there very slightly in that way she had catalogued on day 2. "Is there a way to disrupt the array? The quantum substrate component specifically?" Dara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The component is housed in the primary relay node at the center of the structure you've been building." Reyna understood several things very quickly. The structure she had been building, section by section, from diagrams that showed each piece in isolation. She had been building the thing that was doing this to them. She had been building it with her own hands, and it was almost finished, and when it was finished, whatever was happening to Grum would happen to all of them. And then, perhaps, to something larger, something beyond the perimeter. Something the collective had not yet decided whether or not to contain. She did not say any of this. She said, "Tell me what the relay node looks like." "I can't authorize." "I know you can't authorize it." She waited. "Tell me what it looks like." Dara looked at her clipboard. She turned it over in her hands once, and then she held it out so that Reyna could see the schematic on its surface for exactly the time it took to draw a breath. And then she tucked it against her chest again and walked back toward the transport. The node was a dense sphere of interlocked crystalline components, approximately 60 centimeters in diameter, installed 3 days ago in the central housing of the structure they'd been building, which Reyna now understood was a signal amplifier. The collective's attempt to scale up the array, to take what worked in 600 meters and make it work in 600 kilometers or 6,000 or more. She had 3 days, maybe 4. She told Maya and Tella first, because they were the sharpest and because they had been filtering the phenomenon better than most. She suspected it was the card games, the constant social engagement, the way they kept each other anchored in the present tense. She told Pak because she needed his hands, and because anyone who sat in the dirt to watch their seedlings come up was someone you could trust with the truth. She told 3 others she had been quietly assessing since day 1. She did not tell Grum. She brought him the remaining bottles from the communal store and sat with him for a while in the afternoon light, and they talked about things with no relevance. A place he had built once on a water moon. The way the light fell there. A woman named Sienna who had waited for him for 4 years and then hadn't. His voice when he talked about those things was entirely his own. She stayed until his eyes got the unfocused quality again, and then she left him with the light on. The relay node was connected to the array's power coupling by a sequence of interlocking modulators. If you remove them in the wrong order, the energy discharge would be large enough to flatten the barracks. Reyna had spent 2 hours with the schematic she'd memorized from Dara's clipboard, tracing the circuit paths in the margins of her notebook, and she was fairly sure she had the right sequence. Fairly sure was not the same as certain. She did it anyway. On day 34, she took Maya and Tella and Pak and the 3 others, and they went to the central housing at 2 in the morning, which was deep in the 4-hour dark, the stars enormous above them, the artificial breeze carrying its faint insect frequency hum. She had tools. She had the sequence. She had the awareness, present and quiet in the back of her mind, that if she was wrong, this ended in approximately 8 seconds. She was not wrong. Or not wrong enough to matter. The third modulator was the dangerous one. It has a secondary coupling she hadn't been able to trace cleanly from memory. And when she touched it, the node pulsed once with a light that seemed to keep from him inside rather than outside, a color she did not have a word for and did not try to find one for. And in that pulse she heard every voice she had ever loved speaking simultaneously in the same frequency band as her own heartbeat, and she understood, in a way she would never be able to fully translate into language, that whatever was living in the quantum substrate of this place was not malevolent. It was simply so vast and so old and so utterly unlike anything that had ever had a childhood or a daughter or a small plot of land it was saving for something, that the gap between its nature and theirs was producing, as a side effect, the sound of her daughter laughing in an empty field. She held that understanding for exactly the time it took to breathe, and then she removed the third modulator, and the node went dark, and the field dropped, and the strange bent quality of the light at the perimeter straightened out like a kink, worked from a cable. And from somewhere on the other side of the barracks she heard Grum make a sound. A short surprise sound, like a man who has just put down something very heavy, and is only now realizing how long he's been carrying it. They were out of the zone by dawn, all 12 of them carrying what they could. Grum had brought his folding chair. Pak had brought his seedlings, packed carefully in a piece of torn insulation foam. The sisters had their cards. Reyna had her notebook. The monitoring station transport came 2 hours later. Not the usual pair of observers. 6 security officers, and Korvac and Dara, who stepped off the ramp with the expression of a person who had prepared for a confrontation and found instead something she did not have a category for. She stopped in front of Reyna. "The array is down," she said. "Yes, the collective will. I know what the collective will do." Reyna looked at her. The light out here beyond the perimeter was flat and gray and honest in the way that cold light is honest. "Will you tell them what the threshold was?" Dara looked at the transport, at the ground, at Reyna. "No," she said. "I'll tell them the phenomenon was more destabilizing than the models predicted. I'll tell them the workers self-evacuated as a precaution." "That's true." "Yes," Dara said. "It's true. Will they send another team?" The silence lasted long enough that a cold wind moved through it, carrying the faint smell of the wasteland, mineral and clean and inhospitable, and above them the sky was entirely clear and entirely without color, the kind of sky that does not promise anything. "I don't know," Dara said, and then, more quietly, "I'm going to make a recommendation." Reyna looked at her. "The phenomenon in the substrate is real. It's also intelligent. Not in any way we have a framework for, but..." She paused, and Reyna recognized the pause, had seen it in her notebook many times, the space where the right words haven't been invented yet. "It's not trying to harm. It's trying to understand. It was using the array to..." She stopped again. "To listen. To see if we were worth listening to." Reyna thought about the moment with the third modulator, the voices, the color with no name. "What will you recommend?" she asked. "That we talk to it differently," Dara said. "Without putting humans inside it first." There was a long pause. Somewhere behind them, Grum had unfolded his chair and was sitting in it, facing the wastelands, loose on his knees, his face turned toward the distance with an expression of a man who is simply glad for now to be cold. "Good recommendation," Reyna said. She built the structure on Haverith Station the following year. It was small, 2 rooms, a covered porch facing the water, but it was well made, precisely fitted, each joint and angle exactly what she intended. And when her daughter walked through the door for the first time, she put both hands flat on the walls and said it felt solid. And Reyna said yes. "It does." She kept the notebook. All the entries were still in it, including the shorthand observations from the test zone, including the note she had written on the 14th day. Voice, east, dusk. 40 hers below the threshold. Not real, just the zone. She had crossed out the last 2 words on the day she left. Not because she thought they were wrong, because she thought they were incomplete. In the back of the notebook, on the last page, She had written one thing more, added the night before she sealed the house and filed the record with the station archive. It was not an entry in any formal sense. It was just a sentence. She had written, "We are very small things that will not stop trying to understand, and that is not nothing." She looked at it for a while. Then she closed the notebook and put it on the shelf above the door where she would see it every time she came in from outside. And she went to sit on the porch with her daughter and watch the light change on the water, which it did slowly, and then all at once, and then slowly again. In the monitoring station files, the incident was logged as terraforming array disruption, worker safety evacuation, priority 3. The array remained offline. The quantum substrate phenomenon was reclassified from minor psychoacoustic effect to active non-anthropic intelligence, contact class unknown, engagement protocol pending. The pending status lasted 4 years. Then a xenocommunications team arrived with equipment that didn't require putting anyone inside the field. And they spent 18 months learning what the substrate was trying to say, and what it had apparently been trying to say for approximately 60,000 years, to every civilization that had ever been unlucky or curious enough to touch it. The message, when they finally rendered it into something translatable, was about 20,000 words long. It was complex, self-referential, and in several places paradoxical in ways that took another 2 years to resolve. The first sentence, the opening, the thing it had been broadcasting into the quantum foam of this particular stretch of dead planet since before humans had fire, was very short. It said, "Are you the kind of thing that stays?" The communications team spent 3 days debating how to respond. They consulted xenolinguists and philosophers, and 2 different governmental bodies, and a historian who specialized in first contact protocols, and who said, after reading the question, that there was really only one honest answer. They sent, "Yes, we are exactly that kind of thing." And somewhere in the substrate of the Kariv wasteland, in the quantum architecture of a mind that had been waiting for 60,000 years, something that might have been recognition moved through the dark like a warm current, like the particular quality of light on the 14th day of an artificial summer, like the sound of a laugh from 42 light years away, that is not nothing, is not nothing, is not nothing at all.